Hi everyone, with our main page layout completed for the desktop, it's now time to work on some responsive design. Responsive design describes conditions in which your browser window listens to the width and makes changes, and also whether it is a browser on a desktop or a mobile screen, or it's in portrait mode and landscape mode. But we're just going to focus on the simple listening to width of your browser window. And as I was showing you at the end of the last video where we left off, our layout looks very nice on the desktop with our cards divided across the two spaces of these two containers the way we want them to. But as we collapse our layout, you can see that there is no adjustment being made. All right, the screen starts to get very compressed and the layout makes very little sense and is hardly readable. So that's an issue we're going to need to deal with, and the way we're going to deal with that is using what are called media queries. In this version, the final version, you can see as I collapse, at a certain point, a break point, you can see the width goes, the top container goes from being 50-50 to something else, where this takes up less space and this takes up more space. All right, and then as we go even smaller, eventually they all take up the entire space. And not only that, the hero, if we look, this monsters, it's time to fix up that awful hairdo, becomes a feature hero box, no longer just a feature box. And all of the main cards become a single type. They're no longer, so every feature box becomes the feature hero type, and every main box becomes a single type as well. And that's going to be accomplished with our CSS. So we're going to use two tools. We have Gridlex, has its core responsive features, as well as we're going to have to write some CSS to make our cards change so that they all are the same. All the heroes are the same and all of the mains are the same once we get down to the smallest size. But let's start by looking at Gridlex. So when I was first introducing Gridlex, I was showing you how we have our columns and here we go. We have a grid and then we have a column, all right? And you can see that this is column -6, which means it takes up 50% of the space, all right? So let's scroll down to where that is. It's not this area. Here we go, all right? Okay. I think it's this one. Oh no, this is the nested grid. So let's keep moving down. Here it is. Okay, so you can see that these take up 50% of the space, 50% of the space, 50% of the space, and again 50% of the space. Okay, but you can see that it has this underscore SM-12. And so what this is basically a modifier saying is that when we get to a smaller screen, have this column take up 100% of the width. So these are going to end up at a certain point, all of these columns are going to take up 100% of the width of the space. So if we collapse this, there we go. You can see now they're taking up 100% of the space. All right, 100%, 100%, 100%. Okay. The grid, you can see the column 4 does not have a modifier, nor does the column 8 and the column 6 inside. But if we did the same thing, right, and we said col 4, and we put underscore SM-12, let's move this up so you can see it. So this col 4 should, after I'm finished here, take up 100% of the space here. And you can see it did. And we can do this for any of these columns. All right, so we can have any of these columns have, so you can see this is taking up only 8 right now. This particular div is taking up 8, but if I add the underscore SM-12, you can see it also now takes up 100% of the space. So by adding these modifiers, we can make adjustments, and you can actually string them together. And so we could actually change this. Let's say at small, it takes up 10, and then at extra small, it takes up 12. All right. So right now, while we're still at small, it's only taking up 10. All right. This div right here is only taking up 10, but if we keep getting smaller, eventually it'll break and it's back to taking up all 12 columns or the full width across. So you can actually string together multiple modifiers to a potential column. So the idea is, the default is, hey, have it take up 4 columns. But as you get to a small screen, have it take up 10 columns. As it gets to an extra small screen, have it take up all 12 columns or the full width. All right. And so we're going to be doing exactly that. And just to give you a sense of what those numbers mean exactly as part of their media query system and how a media query works, which we're about to get to, they have these default settings right at the bottom here. Here we go. So it describes how these classes work by adding your underscores, all right, and how you can string them together. You can show here again, it's showing the kind of the opposite of what we were doing. It's taking up less and less space rather than more and more space. And each of these media queries, you can see, use this syntax. It says, at the media with a max width of 36 REM, which is extra small, or basically 576 pixels, which means, and I'm going to show you the documentation about media queries. It says, whenever the browser's viewport is equal to or narrower than that value. All right. So the idea is, whenever the browser is equal to 576 or smaller, then use all the values inside of here. So we're going to learn how this syntax works with our custom CSS that we have to write, but just show it to you. I'll show you the demo, even though we're not going to write any CSS, and we're going to put this in. It's often that we put it at the bottom. All right. So at the very bottom here, we would have our at media query. All right, and we're going to say max width, and we'd say 576 pixels. And then inside of here, we do stuff. And we actually can reselect any of our selectors, and it'll use the CSS of any of the CSS selectors we write down here whenever the browser window is 576 pixels or smaller. All right. So that's what we're going to be doing when we adjust our CSS for all of our cards and how we want them to change. But for now, what we want to do is focus on Gridlex's system, all right, and how we can use our modifiers, okay? And so that means we get to work simply within the HTML, all right? So if we saw again in our version, we had initially, here we'll show the final version here, sorry. We have our one breakpoint at the small point right there, okay? So those two columns go from 50-50 to something else, and that breakpoint is happening at the small, right, or at 768 pixels. And then if we go even smaller, at 576, and you can see the number right up there, we'll eventually get to 576, and they're all going to take up 100% of the space. All right, so we're going to need to use the small modifier and the XS or extra small modifier. All right, we have our small modifier and tell me how many columns it should take up, and the extra small modifier. All right, so in our top container in our grid, we're going to have this at the small. We're going to have the hero on the left take up only 4, all right, but of course when it gets to extra small, it's going to take up all 12, Okay. And then when this one goes to small, we want to give it more spacing, have it take up 8 columns. But when it's extra small, it also will take up 12. Okay. So let's have a look at that and see if that was successful. All right, so let's go across to small. All right, that works. You can see it goes from 50/50 to 33/66, and then if we go all the way down, you can see it takes up 100% of the space, but these are still taking up 50/50. So we need to tell these columns to also, when you get to extra small, go to 12. All right. So within this grid, we have a column. This one's fine because it's taking up 100% of the space the whole time. But these, when they get to extra small, we say XS-12, and this one too, underscore XS-12. So when we get to the extra small width, take up all 12 columns, and we save that. And you can see now they take up 100% of the space. And as soon as we get to the bigger page, they go back and take up, everything goes back to where it was. And then you can see we still need to work on the bottom, all right? Because this is still, those are taking up 100% of the space. These are not, okay? And we're going to use, if you notice in our final version, at a certain point, at that extra small or at a small, it's actually at the small, we have the columns on the right disappear. So at the small size, all right, you can see this entire column gets hidden. And there's a nice modifier built into Gridlex to add a hidden class to that particular container. So before it goes to extra small, it first, in the small state, all right, it just hides that column, and that's part of Gridlex's system. You can see there's this modifier you can use here where you can say, hey, add a class of sm-hidden or xs or any of these values, lg, md, sm, or xs, but it's small. We're going to actually match this. Let's hide that second column, as well as the other column. When it gets to extra small, take up 100%, or when it gets to small and lower, take up 100% of the space. All right. So we want it, as soon as it hides, we're going to have this take up 100% of the space as well. So we're not going to wait for this lower section to get all the way to extra small before it takes up 100% of the space. We're going to have it take up 100% of the space once it gets to small. So we'll make those two adjustments. So in the lower container, so our upper container is complete. In the lower container, we have our grid. And then we're going to have our modifier that says it's small, have it take up 12. All right. And then for this one, we're adding a second class that when it's small, we're going to just hide it using this sm-hidden class. All right. And so with that part, I think we should be all set. Yep. So you can see the bottom now takes up 100% of the space. All right. And then when it gets above there, you can see that the columns are all showing up. Now the last thing we need to complete is the work on the cards. Okay. You can see how the cards themselves change. And that's our CSS. We can't do that with Gridlex, and so in our final video, we are going to use a media query in our style.css and make adjustments to our CSS so that all the cards that are main primary or main secondary look the same, and then all the feature cards become feature hero cards. Okay, so we don't have at the top this feature card followed by this still same feature, main primary and main secondary. They'll all look the same.